Hi guys, today I'm going to read Chapter 2 of Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's Farm. Chapter 2, The Pet Forgetter Cure. Rebecca Rolfe loved pets so much, her bedroom looked like a zoo. On the brewer was a goldfish bowl with 4 goldfish in it. On the bedside table was a dish filled with rocks, under which lived 2 turtles. In a can on the desk were 27 tadpoles. In the planter lamp on the desk lived a chameleon. On Rebecca's pillow lay a large gray cat. Under the bed was a basket with 4 kittens in it. Also under the bed was an English setter who snored. On the foot of the bed slept a Scottie. Then in the backyard, Rebecca had 2 guinea pigs, a Belgian hare, a baby robin, 4 white mice, and a bantam rooster. Her mother and father were glad that Rebecca loved animals, except for one thing. Her animals were so noisy. Starting at the crack of dawn every morning, the bantam rooster crowed. The dog skidded down the front stairs after the paper boy yelping, "Let us at him!" The gray cat meowed and leapt on Mr. Rolfe's chest and switched her tail in his mouth to let him know she wanted to go out. The guinea pig squealed, the goldfish splashed, the baby robin shrieked. The rabbit thumped and the white mice squeaked. And every morning, Mr. Rolfe stormed out of bed and stamped around shouting, "We've just got to clean out this place. It's driving me insane." I never get a night's sleep. A man's home should be his castle, a place to relax and find peace. This house is a nightmare. All night long, things yelp or crow or squawk or meow or thump or bark. Then Rebecca would come out of her room bawling, "If my pets go, I go. We'll all run away." Mrs. Rolfe would say, "Now, Wolverton, don't be harsh. Don't shout. You are upsetting Rebecca." "Who is shouting?" Mr. Rolfe would roar. And another day would be spoiled, and even if Mrs. Rolfe had buckwheat cakes and sausage, nobody would eat any breakfast. This unpleasant state of affairs went on and on until Mrs. Rolfe was as white as her icebox. Mr. Rolfe was as red and crabby as a crab. Rebecca's face and eyes were so blotchy and swollen from crying, everybody thought she had permanent measles. And the neighbors had begun to complain about the noise. Then one morning, Mrs. Rolfe was talking to her neighbor, Mrs. Bent Smith. Mrs. Bent Smith said, "My goodness, we're getting crowded over here. Ronald brought Cedric home another pet last night, a snowy owl." "Does Cedric have pets too?" Mrs. Rolfe asked. "Oh my, yes," Mrs. Bent Smith said. "He has 7 cats, 11 kittens, 6 dogs, a parrot, 2 canaries, a skunk, deodorized of course, a burro, a guinea hen, a mallard duck, a large turtle, and 37 goldfish." "But they're so quiet," Mrs. Rolfe said. "We have pets too, and they bark and yelp and meow and squawk and crow and thump and splash from morning till night." Wolverton is at the end of his patience, and I'm afraid Rebecca's face will be scarred from bawling so much. "I can't understand the animals being so noisy," said Mrs. Bent Smith. "There must be something wrong. When do you feed them?" "I really don't know," said Mrs. Rolfe. "Rebecca tends to that." "Maybe that is your trouble," said Mrs. Bent Smith. "Perhaps Rebecca forgets to feed and water them. It is a common childish fault. I know I have to keep after Cedric all the time. Well, I must go in. I am baking dog biscuits, and I don't want them to burn." When Rebecca came home for lunch, Mrs. Rolfe said, "Rebecca, dear, did you feed your animals last night?" "Oh, gosh, I forgot," Rebecca said. "Did you feed them this morning?" her mother asked. "Oh, gosh, I forgot," Rebecca said. "What about water?" her mother said. "I noticed yesterday that the goldfish needed their water changed, and the turtles were almost out of it." "Oh, gosh, I forgot," Rebecca said, through a mouthful of pickle and peanut butter. "All right, young lady," said Mrs. Rolfe. "You get up from the table this instant and take care of your animals. No, leave your sandwich. You couldn't possibly be as hungry as your pets." So Rebecca fed and watered her animals, and in the next day everything was peaceful, and Mr. Rolfe had kippered herring and scrambled eggs for breakfast, and was as cheerful as the baby robin. What a glorious morning, he said, passing his cup for more coffee. I think I'll come home early and cut the lawn. You must have had a good sleep, Mrs. Rolfe said. I'll have the lawnmower sharpened. Oh, don't bother until I see if I can get off, said Mr. Rolfe quickly. Where's Rebecca? Out feeding her animals, said her mother. She has become very conscientious about them, which is why they are behaving so nicely. Good, good, said Mr. Rolfe. You see, my dear, shouting at her did some good. After all, the trouble with you women is that you always resist any form of discipline for your children. Discipline, my dear, makes men great. Show me a man who has had firm discipline, and I'll show you a great man. Now, when I was a boy, you're going to be late for work, Mrs. Rolfe said hastily. Here, I'll get your coat. Rebecca didn't come in for breakfast, and didn't come in for breakfast, and didn't come in for breakfast. Mrs. Rolfe heated up the scrambled eggs until they were like rubber and kept the toast hot until it was hard as iron. Rebecca didn't appear until almost 12 o'clock. When she did come in, she had green paint in her hair and on her cheek. Where in the world have you been? Mrs. Rolfe said. I kept your breakfast hot until after 11. I've been over helping Mr. Matthews paint his garage, Rebecca said, going to the cookie jar. No cookies until after lunch, said her mother. Did you feed and water the animals before you left? Oh gosh, I forgot, Rebecca said, sitting down at the table and beginning to gulp her soup. All right, march right out and take care of them, Mrs. Rolfe said. But Mom, I'm starving, Rebecca said. I didn't have any breakfast either. Neither did your pets, said her mother. Now march. And that is the way it went, day after day. Sometimes Rebecca remembered her pets, but more often she didn't. At her bridge club, Mrs. Rolfe was so nervous and upset she couldn't even eat, although Mrs. Ellingshaw had her favorite ripe olive, cashew nut, raisin, candied cherry, whipped cream, and cucumber salad. Mrs. Ellingshaw, who had gone to a lot of trouble with the lunch, said, What in the world is the matter with you, Cassandra? You haven't touched a thing. Here, have one of these peanut butter sardine and marmalade sandwiches. They are your favorite. No, thank you, Emily, said Mrs. Rolfe listlessly. I'm just not hungry. Are you sick? Asked Mrs. Foghorn. Oh, no, said Mrs. Rolfe. Are you in Wolverton having trouble? Asked Mrs. Sharp. Oh, heavens no, said Mrs. Rolfe. Of course not. Even the Secretary of the United States Treasury could keep a budget the way Wolverton wants it, but we get along, especially as long as I give in to him. You poor thing, said Mrs. Mousetrap, although I don't know why I say poor thing to you when I have to put up with Evinrude day after day. What is the trouble, Cassandra? Asked Mrs. Ellingshaw. You can tell us. We're your best friends, and you know we'll never breathe a word of it. Well, said Mrs. Rolfe, it's Rebecca. She has about 10 million pets, and she forgets to feed them, and then they squawk and bark and yelp and meow and thump and splash and keep us awake all night. I've yelled at her until I'm hoarse, and still she forgets. I'm just at my wit's end. The thing for you to do, said Mrs. Ellingshaw, is to call Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. But I thought she had moved out of town, said Mrs. Rolfe. She has, said Mrs. Ellingshaw. She moved to a farm, but it is only a little way out, and anyway, she usually has the children stay with her until they are cured. Why don't you go and call her right now, said Mrs. Mousetrap. Yes, call her right now, said Mrs. Ellingshaw, and then you will feel like eating some of my delicious dessert. I made a chocolate walnut, whipped cream, banana, devil's food, coconut, peanut brittle, frozen custard. Oh, yummy, said all the women. Mrs. Rolfe left the table to call Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. Why, Rebecca Rolfe, said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly on Friday afternoon. You've grown so big I hardly recognize you, and you're very pretty. I'm still a tomboy, though, said Rebecca. I'm the pitcher for the neighborhood baseball team. I was tackle on our football team, and I can spit through my front teeth. Good for you, said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. How would you like to learn to milk a cow? I'd love to, said Rebecca, and I'd like to pitch hay and clean out the barn and curry the horse. Well, said Mrs. Rolfe, it seems to me that Rebecca will be very happy here. How long can I stay? Asked Rebecca. How about 2 weeks? Said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. Oh boy, can I, Mom? Asked Rebecca. It is may I, Mother, said Mrs. Rolfe, and the answer is yes. Oh, goody, said Rebecca, giving her mother a hug. Well, I guess I better go down to the barn and make friends with the animals. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, darling, said Mrs. Rolfe with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Piggly Wiggly said, Now don't worry, Mrs. Rolfe. Rebecca and I are old friends, and we'll get along beautifully. I know you will, said Mrs. Rolfe, sniffing, but I'm lonely for Rebecca already. She got in her car and drove away. Rebecca waved at her from the hayloft door. All animals know when somebody loves them and is not afraid of them, and Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's animals adored Rebecca immediately. She could even get in the pen with Fanny and her piglets, which was very remarkable because Franny was quite disagreeable and usually tried to bite anyone who came in her pen. Lester, Wag, and Lightfoot of course loved her and followed her all over the farm. Even Warren the gander wasn't too nasty to her and only hissed when he was a long way off. She curried Trotsky until he shone like satin, and then she led him out to the watering trough and scrubbed his hooves with soap and stiff scrubbing brush. She gave Lester a bath with shampoo, rubbed him dry with one of Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's bath towels, and put Lily on the Valley cologne behind his ears. She cleaned out all the stalls in the barn and put in fresh new straw. She cleaned out the chicken houses and put in fresh peat moss. She made a little pen for Franny's babies out in the orchard, turned Franny into Lester's pen, scrubbed Franny's pen out with hot soap and water, and covered the floor with clean, sweet-smelling sawdust. She tidied up Penelope's cage and cleaned out the rabbit hutches and the turkey pens. She was busy and helpful and happy. I just don't know how I ran this farm without you, Mrs. Piggly Wiggly told her, especially now that you're learning to milk. I'd like to live here forever, Rebecca said. I love farms and I love animals and I love you. Wag licked her hand. Lightfoot jumped onto her shoulder and Penelope said, We love Rebecca. We love beautiful Rebecca. Everything was just as happy as could be for 1 week. Then came the day when Mrs. Piggly Wiggly had to take Lester into the Hendricks to cure a noose in her bad table manners. Mrs. Piggly Wiggly had to leave very early because the 6:30 bus was the only one that came through Little Spring Valley. She told Rebecca that she would try to be home before dark. Rebecca said, Don't worry, Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. I'll feed the animals and milk Arbutus. Shall I turn Trotsky into the smooth pasture with the sheep? That would be fine, said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly, and don't forget Heather's calf meal. And be sure the baby chicks and ducklings and goslings are in before dark. You know how anxious Pulser the owl is to get his claws on them. Oh, yes, there is a pail of sour milk in the cellar to mix with Franny's food. Well, I guess I'd better be off or I'll miss my bus. Come, Lester. Rebecca hugged and kissed Mrs. Piggly Wiggly and Lester and waved at them until her arm ached. Then she showed down to the barn. She was just going to turn on the water in the watering trough when she heard a funny noise down by the oat field. It was kind of a chug-chug-chug, like a steam engine. She strained her eyes, but she couldn't quite see because the chicken house was in the way. So she ran to the top of the hill, and a big maple tree was in the way. Finally, she ran all the way down to the oat field. Still, she couldn't see anything, so she ran through the oat field until she came to the lime fence, and just there, beyond, in Mr. Larson's wheat field, was a big red tractor, standing still and puffing. Hi there, called Rebecca to the tractor. Hi, answered a voice from the back wheel. I've lost a pin somewhere. Do you want to help me look for it? Sure, said Rebecca. What kind of a pin? Safety or straight? A big tall man stood up and laughed. He said, It's a cotter pin, sort of a nail with 2 prongs on it. Oh, I know, said Rebecca. There's one on my bike. I fix my bike all the time. Good for you, said the man. My name is Nels Larson. What's yours? Rebecca Rolfe, said Rebecca. I'm visiting Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. That's fine, said Nels. Such a very nice woman. I'm going to cut her oats for her when they are ripe. Can I help you? Asked Rebecca. You sure can, said Nels. Now let's look for the pin so I can finish my disking. After almost half an hour of looking, Rebecca found the pin, and as a reward, Nels let her ride on the tractor with him. At lunchtime, he took her home to his house, and Mrs. Larson gave her hot, fresh bread, chicken and dumplings, and wild blackberry pie. She had a wonderful time. But she had forgotten all about Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's animals. Arbutus was bawling in her stall, waiting to be milked and fed. Trotsky stood in his stall, whinnying to be fed and led out to pasture. Franny and her piglets all squealed and grunted for their breakfast. The chickens cackled and cackled, and Egbert shrieked, Breakfast! at the top of his voice. Warren and Evelyn Goose and Millert and Martha Mallard brought their babies over to the watering trough for a swim, but there was no water. Rebecca had forgotten to turn it on. Lightfoot meowed and meowed in the barn door, but her saucer stayed dry. Wag barked and barked, but nobody filled his water dish. Georgette, Lynette, and Paulette brought their babies up by the back porch to see why Mrs. Piggly Wiggly hadn't thrown them any grain and why they didn't have any water. Heather bawled and bawled for her breakfast, and Clemis and her lambs came clear up from the south pasture to see what was the matter. Over at the Larsons, Rebecca shouted, "Giddy up, Charlie!" as she guided the old white horse between the rows of potatoes. She was covered with dirt and perspiration, and her face was as red as a tomato. But she was having a wonderful time. It was almost 6 o'clock when Nels finally told her that she better bring Charlie in for his supper. Supper? Oh my gosh, said Rebecca. Oh my gosh, I forgot to feed the animals, and I forgot to milk Arbutus, and I forgot to turn Trotsky into the pasture. Oh, what will I do? You better run home as fast as your legs can carry you, said Nels. It sounds to me as if you are in trouble. Listen. Through the still evening air across the rolling green fields from Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's farm came all kinds of loud cries for food. Food! Bellowed Arbutus. Milk! Cried Heather. Oh, 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 oats! Whined Trotsky. Grain! Crackled the hens. Water! Belted the sheeps. Milk! Milk! Whined Lightfoot. Food! 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 Barked Wag. Feed me! Feed me! Feed me! Shrieked Penelope. She forgot our food! She forgot our food! Crowed Egbert. Lunch! 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 Grunted Fanny. Feed me! 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 Squealed the 14 piglets. Wheat! 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 Whistled the turkey pullets. We got to gobble, 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 gobble. We want to gobble, 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 said Tom. Shames! Shames! Said Warren Gander. Come back! Come back! Called Martha and Millard Mallard. Rebecca hung her head. I'm so ashamed, she cried. I forgot my friends. Well, being ashamed won't help, Ness said. Just hurry along home and feed them. Goodbye, Nels, Rebecca said. It was awfully nice of you to let me ride the tractor and steer your horse. It was a pleasure, Nels said. Come over any time. Like a swallow, Rebecca darted through the potato patch, across the wheat field, squeezing under the barbed wire fence, tearing the right leg of her jeans, across the oat field, over the little hill, past the chicken house, and into the barn. The noise in there was deafening. Wag saw her first. He dashed down from the house, raced through the door, and ran between her legs, knocking her flat. Then, instead of licking her face in apology, he stood and growled at her. She said, Oh, Wag, please forgive me. I'm truly sorry. I didn't mean to forget your food. Coldly, he turned away and went into Trotsky's stall. Rebecca got up, hurried into the feed room, scooped up a large bucket of mash, and dumped it into Arbutus' feed box. She said, I'm truly sorry, Arbutus. I'll milk you right away. Arbutus turned her head away. Then Rebecca skittered up to the loft stairs and threw down old hay until Trotsky's manger was full. Peering down the chute at him, she said, Oh, Trotsky, please forgive me. Trotsky turned his back on her. Next she raced up to the house and got the slops and bucket of sour milk for Fanny. There were 2 full buckets, and she had quite a time carrying them. She was panting when she got to Fanny's pen. Here, Fanny, old girl, she said, dumping in the whole bucket of clabbered milk. Grrr, said Franny, snapping at her hand. Why, Franny, how could you? Rebecca said, beginning to cry. Blup, 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 said Franny, burying her snout in the milk. Rebecca poured in the other bucket, wiping her eyes on her sleeve, and went in to milk Arbutus. Arbutus' bag was swollen, and she was leaking milk all over the floor. Rebecca felt very ashamed. She was milking as fast as she could, and the milk was swishing into the bucket when she felt a sharp pain in her leg. She looked down, and Lightfoot, tail switching, eyes blazing, was standing with one paw up, ready to scratch her again. Quickly, Rebecca got up and filled Lightfoot's saucer with warm milk. She filled it 3 times before she finished milking. Heather was so hungry she slurped up half the warm milk before Rebecca could fix the calf meal with it. As soon as she had fed Heather, Rebecca strained the rest of the milk. But it is cool. Gave Arbutus some hay, brought her 2 buckets of water, cleaned out her stall, and put in fresh straw. Then she went in to Trotsky. As soon as she stepped into his stall, he backed up and stepped on her foot. "Ow!" she cried. "Trotsky, you are hurting me!" Looking around at her disdainfully, he slowly lifted his hoof. Limping, Rebecca brought him 2 buckets of water when he gulped down. Then she cleaned out his stall, put in fresh straw, and gave him a bucket of oats. She didn't dare go in Franny's pen, but as the piggies were still nursing, she knew they had plenty of food. Then she hurried down to the chicken house. All the chickens had gone to bed, but she filled the mash happers and scraped grain around for the early risers. There were 2 hens on the nest, and when she reached under them to gather the eggs, they pecked her wrist hard. After she had taken care of the chickens, Rebecca fed the ducks and geese and rabbits and the mother hens. Then she watered the sheep. Heavens, but she was tired and hungry. She went up to the house. Immediately Penelope shrieked at her. "Well, about time, Mrs. Gadding all day. Where's supper? Where's supper? Where's supper?" "Please, dear, dear Penelope, forgive me," Rebecca said. "I'll get your supper right away." She tried to open the back door, but it was locked. "What will I do, poor Penelope?" she said, rattling the doorknob. When on the bench by the pump, she saw the box of parrot crunch. "Now, you poor dear little hungry parrot," she said, dumping a cupful into Penelope's feeding cup. Penelope hopped down off her perch, reaching through the bars of the cage, and bit Rebecca's fingers. "Ouch!" Rebecca yelled. "Serves you right, bad girl," Penelope said. "Wag, come up to the back porch," and barking at her. "Quiet, dog," Penelope yelled. "I'm eating." "Yap, yap, yap," Wag said, sitting down on Rebecca's feet. "Oh, poor Waggy," she said. "You want your supper. I'll go in the house and get it if you'll get off my feet." Wag obligingly moved. Rebecca tried to open the back door, but it was still locked. "I'll get you a drink of water anyway," she said, going over to the pump. She was priming the pump when, to her surprise, she saw Wag's dish filled with dog food in the sink. "Gosh, Mrs. Piggly Wiggly never forgets anything," she said, lifting out the dish and setting it on the floor. Wag rushed over and began to choke down the food. Rebecca pumped him a bowl of water, filling Penelope's water dish, and then went around to the front of the house to see if that door was locked, too. It was. "That's funny," Rebecca said. "Mrs. Piggly Wiggly doesn't usually lock her doors." She tried the windows. They were locked, too. So, feeling very hungry and very neglected, she went around and sat down on the back steps to wait for Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. Like giant black cobwebs, dust settled over the willow tree, the barn, the chicken house, the tool shed, the orchard trees. A big yellow moon came up from behind the Larsons' peach orchard. In the swampy place down in the lane, a million little frogs began to trill. The animals were all quiet now. Except the frogs, everything was quiet. Quiet and lonely. 2 large tears rolled out of Rebecca's nice brown eyes and slid down over her rosy cheeks. Wag came over and lay down beside her. Burying his head in his fur, she said, "I'm hungry and lonely, and I think Mrs. Piggly Wiggly has forgotten all about me." Turning his head around, Wag licked her cheek, which only made Rebecca feel more sorry for herself and cry louder. Then suddenly the quietness of the night was shattered into a million pieces. The ducks began to quack, the geese honked, Layette, Paulette, and Georgette shrieked hysterically. Wag barked, Trotsky neighed, Lightfoot meowed. "What is it? What's the matter?" Rebecca said to Wag. "It's Pulser, the owl," Penelope said, yawning. "He's after the baby chickens, or the goslings, or the ducklings. There he goes, past the moon. He can't do any harm, though. All the babies are shut up." "Oh, no, they aren't," said Rebecca, jumping off the porch. "Oh, here he comes. Shoo! Shoo, Pulser! Go away, you bad owl!" she shouted, grabbing the broom and running down to the willow tree, where all the commotion seemed to be. Down Pulser swooped, as quick, as dark as a shadow. He was heading right for the goslings. His wicked claws were opened, ready to snatch up one of the small, drowny bodies. Running so fast she was almost flying, Rebecca didn't see Warren, who was wings outstretched, was bravely trying to guard his babies. Rebecca fell right over him and landed with a splash in the watering trough. But as she fell, she managed to clout Pulitzer hard with the broom. He zigzagged for a minute or two, then swooped up to the ridgepole of the barn. After she had scrambled out of the watering trough, Rebecca picked up her broom, herded all the chickens, geese, and ducklings into the barn, and shut the door. Then, shaking her fist up at Pulitzer, she said, "You keep away from here, you mean old thing!" Pulitzer said, "Hoo, hoo, hoo," and flew into the orchard. Just then, Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's flashlight came bobbing along the lane like a lightning bug. Rebecca Wags and Lightfoot ran to meet her. After she had kissed and petted them all, she said, "My goodness, Rebecca, you feel a little wet. What happened?" So Rebecca told her everything. How she had forgotten to feed and water the animals, how she had forgotten to milk, how she had forgotten to shut up the goslings, ducklings, and chicks, and Pulitzer had almost gotten them. Mrs. Piggly Wiggly said, "Well, everything has been taken care of, and old Pulitzer didn't get anything. So what do you say we wipe away the tears and go in the house?" "But we can't," Rebecca said. "We can't get in the house. The doors are all locked, and I can't find the key." "Oh, how careless of me," said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly. "I forgot and locked the doors. That means you haven't had any supper, you poor child." Rebecca began to cry again. "I'm freezing and starving," she sobbed. "It's amazing how uncomfortable it is to be forgotten," said Mrs. Piggly Wiggly, fishing in her purse for her door key. "Now you run up and put on your nightie, and I'll make hot cocoa and toast. I think there's some cold fried chicken in the pantry, and I know there's some gingerbread." Of course, that was the last time Rebecca ever forgot about a pet. When she went home at the end of 2 weeks, Mrs. Piggly Wiggly trusted her so much she gave her Brookfield, the little runt pig, a gosling named Gordon, a duckling named Dalrympe, and 2 baby chickens, Chauncey and Serval. When her daddy saw Rebecca, she was very happy, but when he saw her new pets, he made a kind of mournful groan, slammed the door of his study, and said, "No more rest for me, I can see that." But he was wrong. From that day on, Rebecca took perfect care of her pets, and they were so well behaved that Mrs. Piggly Wiggly often sent other pet forgetters to visit Rebecca so they could see how pets should be cared for. And that is the end of Mrs. Piggly Wiggly's Farm, Chapter 2. If you like my channel, you can like and subscribe below. Thanks for watching.